What if everything you see, everything you touch, everything you remember is not real? This is simulation theory. Once upon a time, a Chinese philosopher fell asleep and dreamed he was a butterfly. He fluttered through gardens, sipping nectar from flowers, utterly absorbed in the experience of being a butterfly, with no awareness that he was anything else. Then he woke up and found himself lying on his couch, unmistakably Zhuangzi the philosopher, in his study. But the dream had been so vivid, so complete, so experientially real, that Zhuangzi found himself unable to resolve a question that would haunt philosophy for the next 24 centuries. Was he a man who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or was he now a butterfly dreaming he was a man? The question sounds whimsical, but its implications are devastating. If a dream can be indistinguishable from waking life while it is being experienced, then there is no subjective test, no internal evidence available to consciousness that can conclusively establish which state is real. The boundary between reality and simulation begins to dissolve. 2,000 years before Zhuangzi and 300 years after him, Greek philosopher Plato posed the same question in a different form. In The Republic, written around 380 BC, Plato imagined prisoners chained since birth in an underground cave, their heads fixed so they could see only the wall before them. Behind them, a fire burned, and between the fire and the prisoners, puppeteers carried objects whose shadows were cast on the wall. The shadows were all the prisoners knew of reality. They named them, studied them, developed theories about their behavior. When one prisoner was freed and dragged into the sunlight, he was initially blinded and confused. The real world was overwhelming, incomprehensible. The prisoner had to learn, slowly and painfully, that the shadows he had taken for reality were mere reflections of something infinitely more real. Plato used the allegory to argue for the existence of ideal forms, abstract realities more fundamental than the sensory world. But the structural parallel to simulation theory is exact. What we perceive as reality could be a processed output, a shadow of a more fundamental underlying reality. In 1641, French philosopher René Descartes undertook the most systematic program of doubt in the history of Western philosophy. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes sought to identify what he could know with absolute certainty by systematically doubting everything that could conceivably be false. He quickly realized that his senses could deceive him. Optical illusions, dreams, and hallucinations demonstrated that sensory experience was not a reliable guide to reality. Then he pushed the doubt further. What if an all-powerful evil demon was deceiving him about every aspect of reality, not just his senses, but mathematics, logic, and the very existence of the physical world? The evil demon hypothesis is the earliest formal philosophical statement of what we would now call the simulation hypothesis, with the demon replaced by a computer and its operators. Descartes found his way out of universal doubt through the famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, arguing that the act of doubting itself proved the existence of a doubter, but he never fully resolved the demon problem. If an omnipotent deceiver exists, even mathematics might be an illusion.
The modern philosophical lineage of the simulation hypothesis passes through Hilary Putnam's brain-in-a-vat thought experiment, proposed in 1981. Putnam asked his readers to imagine that their brain had been removed from their body and placed in a vat of nutrients connected to a supercomputer that feeds it exactly the sensory signals it would receive if it were living a normal life. The brain would experience a complete, coherent reality, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, with no way to detect that it was not actually interacting with a physical world. Putnam's thought experiment was enormously influential in philosophy of mind and epistemology, and it is the most direct philosophical predecessor of the simulation hypothesis. The difference between a brain in a vat and a simulated consciousness is merely one of implementation. In both cases, the experiential reality is generated by a computational process external to the subject. What distinguishes the modern simulation hypothesis from its philosophical ancestors is technology. Zhuangzi's butterfly dream was a meditation on the nature of consciousness. Plato's cave was an allegory for philosophical enlightenment. Descartes' demon was a thought experiment in epistemology. Putnam's brain in a vat was a challenge to semantic externalism. None of these philosophers had access to the concept of digital computation, the idea that any process, including the generation of experiential reality, might be reducible to the manipulation of information according to formal rules. The invention of the electronic computer, the development of virtual reality technology, and the exponential growth of computational power transformed the simulation hypothesis from a philosophical curiosity into a technological possibility. If we can already create rudimentary simulated realities in our video games and virtual reality systems, the argument goes, then a sufficiently advanced civilization could presumably create simulated realities of arbitrary complexity, including realities that contain conscious beings who believe they are living in a real universe. The concept that bridges ancient philosophy and modern technology is substrate independence, the idea that consciousness does not require any specific physical substrate, but can in principle run on any sufficiently complex computational system. If minds can be implemented in silicon as readily as in carbon, then there is no fundamental obstacle to creating conscious beings inside a computer simulation. This premise is controversial. Some philosophers and neuroscientists argue that consciousness is inherently tied to biological processes and cannot be replicated in silicon. But if substrate independence is even possible, then the simulation hypothesis becomes not merely conceivable, but, as Nick Bostrom would argue, probable.
The simulation hypothesis occupies a unique position among the theories examined in this series. Unlike the 9/11 truth movement or the reptilian conspiracy theory, which emerged from internet forums and alternative media, the simulation hypothesis emerged from a peer-reviewed philosophy journal and has been engaged with by professional physicists, computer scientists, and philosophers at the world's leading universities. Unlike the Bermuda Triangle or the Illuminati, which are based on claims that can be investigated and potentially falsified, the simulation hypothesis may be fundamentally untestable, raising the question of whether it belongs in the category of science, philosophy, or religion. And unlike most conspiracy theories, which identify specific human agents as the conspirators, the simulation hypothesis identifies as the potential conspirator an entity so far beyond human comprehension that it might as well be called God.
The theory's appeal extends far beyond academic philosophy. It has been publicly endorsed by some of the most prominent figures in technology, science, and entertainment. It has generated genuine existential anxiety in people who take it seriously. It has been incorporated into spiritual and New Age frameworks, and it has been absorbed into the broader conspiracy theory ecosystem, where it serves as a conceptual foundation for claims about the unreliability of perceived reality. The simulation hypothesis is, in short, the most intellectually respectable conspiracy theory in existence, a distinction that makes it both more interesting and more problematic than any of its companions. Understanding the simulation hypothesis requires moving between multiple modes of analysis: philosophical rigor, scientific assessment, cultural interpretation, and psychological examination. The philosophical arguments are genuinely complex and genuinely unresolved. The scientific evidence is genuinely ambiguous. The cultural impact is genuinely significant, and the psychological effects on individuals who take the theory seriously and on the broader culture that has absorbed it are genuinely consequential. This is not a theory that can be dismissed with a wave of the hand. It must be engaged with on its own terms.
This is the story of the oldest question in human philosophy, dressed in the newest technological clothing. It is the story of how a Swedish-born philosopher at Oxford wrote a paper that made Elon Musk question whether anything is real. It is the story of how The Matrix became not just a movie, but a metaphor for an entire culture's anxiety about the nature of reality. And it is the story of what happens when a philosophical argument escapes the academy and enters the wild, where it is adopted, adapted, and sometimes distorted by communities with very different standards of evidence and very different relationships to doubt. In 2003, Nick Bostrom, a Swedish-born philosopher, then at Yale, now a professor at the University of Oxford, published a paper in the Philosophical Quarterly titled, "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" The paper was not long, approximately 12 pages, but its argument was precise, rigorous, and devastating in its implications. Bostrom did not claim that we are living in a simulation. What he demonstrated was something more unsettling, that at least one of 3 propositions must be true, and that 2 of the 3 propositions are themselves deeply disturbing. The paper launched the modern simulation theory debate, generated hundreds of academic response papers, and eventually escaped the academy entirely to become one of the most discussed philosophical arguments of the 21st century. Bostrom's argument is structured as a trilemma, a logical construction in which at least one of 3 propositions must be true. The 3 propositions are as follows. First, the extinction hypothesis. The fraction of human-level civilizations that reach a post-human stage, a technological level capable of running detailed simulations of conscious minds, is very nearly 0. In other words, civilizations reliably go extinct or stagnate before acquiring the ability to simulate reality. Second, the indifference hypothesis. The fraction of post-human civilizations that choose to run a significant number of ancestor simulations, detailed recreations of their evolutionary history, is very nearly 0. In other words, advanced civilizations that could run simulations choose not to. Third, the simulation hypothesis. We are almost certainly living in a computer simulation right now. The logic connecting these 3 propositions is probabilistic.
Bostrom begins with a simple observation. If many advanced civilizations exist, and a significant fraction of them run ancestor simulations, then each civilization would run many such simulations, potentially billions or trillions. In that scenario, the number of simulated conscious beings would vastly outnumber the number of real conscious beings. If you are a conscious being selected at random from the total population of all conscious beings, real and simulated, the overwhelming probability is that you are simulated, simply because there are so many more simulated beings than real ones. The only ways to escape this conclusion are to deny that advanced civilizations exist, Proposition 1, or to deny that they run simulations, Proposition 2. If neither denial holds, Proposition 3 follows with near certainty. The argument rests on a crucial premise, substrate independence. If consciousness can exist only in biological brains, if there is something about carbon-based neural architecture that is essential to conscious experience and cannot be replicated in silicon or any other computational medium, then simulated beings would not be conscious and the probability calculation fails. Bostrom acknowledges this premise explicitly and argues that it is widely accepted among cognitive scientists and philosophers of mind, though not universally. The substrate independence debate is one of the deepest unresolved questions in philosophy of mind, and the simulation argument's validity ultimately depends on its resolution. The academic reception of Bostrom's paper was substantial and divided. Some philosophers praised the argument as logically valid and genuinely important, a contribution to the long philosophical tradition of reality skepticism that brought new rigor and technological grounding to ancient questions. Others criticize the argument on multiple grounds: that the substrate independence premise is unproven, that the probability calculation involves unjustified assumptions about the behavior of post-human civilizations, that the concept of a post-human civilization may be incoherent, and that the argument proves too much. If taken seriously, it undermines all empirical reasoning and makes science itself impossible.
Bostrom himself has been carefully agnostic about which proposition is true. He has stated that he personally suspects the second or third proposition is most likely, assigning roughly equal probability to each. He has emphasized that the trilemma is not an assertion that we are in a simulation, but a demonstration that at least one of three counterintuitive propositions must hold. This nuance has been largely lost in the public reception of the argument, where the simulation hypothesis has been treated as a standalone claim rather than as one leg of a trilemma. The public discussion of simulation theory overwhelmingly focuses on Proposition 3, the exciting, movie-ready claim that reality is simulated, while ignoring Propositions 1 and 2, which are arguably more important and more disturbing. The paper's trajectory from academic philosophy to mainstream culture was accelerated by its accessibility. Unlike many philosophical papers, Bostrom's argument could be explained in a few minutes to a lay audience. The trilemma structure, 3 options, pick one, was simple enough to grasp without philosophical training, and the conclusion, you might be living in a computer simulation, was dramatic enough to generate media attention. The paper was covered by major news outlets, discussed on popular science programs, and debated on internet forums. By the 2010s, it had achieved a level of public awareness that few philosophical papers ever attain. The paper also attracted attention from physicists who began to consider whether the simulation hypothesis generated testable predictions.
If the universe is a simulation, physicists reasoned, it might contain artifacts of its computational nature, patterns or limitations that would not be expected in a naturally occurring universe. This line of inquiry, attempting to test an inherently philosophical proposition using the methods of empirical science, represented an unusual and productive intersection of disciplines, even if it has not yet produced conclusive results.
The significance of Bostrom's paper extends beyond its specific argument. It demonstrated that the tools of analytic philosophy, precise logical reasoning, probability theory, and careful examination of assumptions could produce genuinely novel and genuinely unsettling conclusions about the nature of reality. It showed that the question of whether reality is what it appears to be was not merely an ancient curiosity, but a live issue with implications for physics, computer science, and the future of humanity. And it provided the intellectual foundation for a cultural phenomenon that would eventually reach far beyond the academy, into Silicon Valley, into Hollywood, and into the conspiracy theory underground. If the simulation hypothesis is true, it should leave traces, fingerprints of computation embedded in the fabric of physical reality. This is the provocative proposition that has drawn physicists into what began as a purely philosophical debate. The idea is straightforward. Just as a video game running on limited hardware produces visible artifacts, frame rate drops, texture pop-in, rendering boundaries, a simulated universe running on finite computational resources might produce analogous artifacts in the laws of physics. The search for these artifacts has produced fascinating science, even if it has not yet produced definitive evidence for or against the simulation hypothesis. Quantum mechanics provides the most frequently cited evidence for the simulation hypothesis, though the connection is more suggestive than conclusive. The central mystery of quantum mechanics, the measurement problem, is that subatomic particles appear to exist in multiple states simultaneously, superposition, until they are measured, at which point they collapse into a single definite state. The double-slit experiment famously demonstrates this. Particles fired at a barrier with two slits produce an interference pattern consistent with wave behavior when unobserved, but produce a particle-like pattern when a detector is placed at the slits. Some simulation theorists have drawn an analogy to computational optimization. A simulation might render the full detail of a scene only when it is being observed, just as a video game renders only what the player is currently looking at. The analogy is suggestive but not rigorous. The measurement problem has multiple interpretations that do not require a simulation framework.
The holographic principle, a property of quantum gravity theory suggesting that the information content of a three-dimensional region of space can be encoded on its two-dimensional boundary, has been cited as evidence that reality has the structure of a computed projection rather than a fundamental three-dimensional space. The holographic principle, developed by Gerard 't Hooft and Leonard Susskind in the 1990s, implies that the three-dimensional universe we experience might be a projection from information encoded on a distant two-dimensional surface. This is structurally similar to a holographic display, a two-dimensional encoding projecting a three-dimensional image, and the parallel to a computational simulation has not been lost on simulation theorists. The Bekenstein bound, the theoretical maximum amount of information that can be contained in a finite region of space, suggests that reality has a finite information content. If the universe is continuous and infinitely divisible, as classical physics assumed, it would contain infinite information. But the Bekenstein bound implies that space is, at some fundamental level, discrete, composed of finite units of information rather than infinitely divisible
invisible continuum. This is precisely the structure one would expect in a digital simulation, where reality is ultimately composed of discrete computational units, bits or qubits, rather than continuous mathematical entities. The fine-tuning of physical constants has been a source of philosophical wonder long before the simulation hypothesis. The values of the fundamental physical constants, the gravitational constant, the speed of light, the mass of the electron, the strength of the nuclear forces, appear to be tuned within extremely narrow ranges that permit the existence of stable atoms, stars, planets, and life. If any of these constants differed by even small amounts, the universe would be radically different, perhaps consisting only of radiation, or collapsing immediately after the Big Bang, or expanding too rapidly for structures to form. The simulation hypothesis offers a natural explanation for this fine-tuning. The constants were set by the simulator, who chose values that would produce an interesting and complex universe to observe.
The mathematical structure of physical laws is itself a source of suggestive evidence. Physicist Eugene Wigner wrote a famous essay in 1960 titled The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences, observing that the laws of physics are described with extraordinary precision by relatively simple mathematical equations. Why should the universe be comprehensible through mathematics at all? The simulation hypothesis offers a natural answer. The universe is mathematical because it was programmed mathematically, just as a video game's physics engine is described by the mathematical equations its programmers wrote. Physicist Silas Bean and colleagues at the University of Washington published a paper in 2012 proposing a specific testable prediction of the simulation hypothesis. They argued that if the universe is simulated on a discrete lattice, a grid structure similar to those used in lattice quantum chromodynamics simulations, then the lattice structure would impose a maximum energy on cosmic ray particles. Specifically, the distribution of the highest energy cosmic rays would show a directional anisotropy. They would be slightly more likely to arrive from certain directions, corresponding to the axes of the computational lattice. The prediction was technically testable, though the data available at the time was insufficient to confirm or refute it. The weight of the physical evidence must be assessed honestly. It is suggestive, not conclusive. Every piece of evidence cited in support of the simulation hypothesis has alternative explanations that do not require a simulation framework. Quantum mechanics can be interpreted through the many worlds interpretation, the Copenhagen interpretation, or various decoherence theories without invoking simulation. The holographic principle is a property of quantum gravity theories that makes no reference to simulation. The Bekenstein bound reflects fundamental thermodynamic properties of black holes. Fine-tuning can be explained by the anthropic principle or by multiverse theories. The mathematical structure of physics may simply reflect the nature of the universe rather than its programmed origin. The simulation hypothesis is compatible with all this evidence, but it is not required by any of it.
The distinction between compatible and required is crucial for evaluating the simulation hypothesis as a scientific proposition. A good scientific theory makes specific predictions that distinguish it from alternatives, predictions that would be confirmed if the theory is true and falsified if it is false. The simulation hypothesis, as currently formulated, makes very few such predictions. It is compatible with virtually any observation because a sufficiently powerful simulator could produce any physical reality. This compatibility is not a strength, it is the signature of an untestable hypothesis. The simulation hypothesis may be true, but if it is compatible with every possible observation, it is not a scientific hypothesis in any meaningful sense. It is a philosophical position, and evaluating it requires philosophical tools rather than physical experiments. In June 2016, at a technology conference in California, a journalist asked Elon Musk, then the richest or second richest person in the world, depending on the day's stock prices, about the simulation hypothesis. Musk's response was immediate, confident, and widely quoted. "The strongest argument for us being in a simulation is the following. 40 years ago, we had Pong, 2 rectangles and a dot. That is what games were. Now, 40 years later, we have photorealistic 3D simulations with millions of people playing simultaneously, and it is getting better every year. Soon we will have virtual reality, augmented reality. If you assume any rate of improvement at all, then the games will become indistinguishable from reality. Given that there are likely billions of such civilizations, the odds that we are in base reality is 1 in billions." Musk's endorsement was not unique. Astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson stated publicly that he gave the simulation hypothesis a 50-50 chance of being correct, and numerous other prominent scientists and technologists have expressed varying degrees of sympathy with the idea, but it was by far the most visible and most consequential. Musk's cultural authority in the 2010s and 2020s was immense. As the founder or co-founder of Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and other companies, he embodied the technological optimism that made the simulation hypothesis feel plausible. If the man building rockets and neural interfaces believed we might be in a simulation, the idea acquired a credibility that no number of philosophy papers could provide. The logic of Musk's argument is a simplified version of Bostrom's, but with a crucial difference. Bostrom presented a careful trilemma that acknowledged multiple possible conclusions. Musk collapsed the trilemma into a single conclusion. Given the trajectory of gaming technology, we are almost certainly in a simulation. This collapse ignores the first 2 propositions of Bostrom's trilemma: the possibility that civilizations go extinct before developing simulation capacity, or that they choose not to simulate. By focusing exclusively on the extrapolation of gaming technology, Musk's argument assumes both that advanced civilizations will exist and that they will choose to run simulations, exactly the assumptions Bostrom was careful not to make. Silicon Valley's particular receptivity to the simulation hypothesis is not coincidental. The technology industry's culture is built on the premise that complex systems can be understood as information processing, that biology is code, that intelligence is computation, that reality is data. Engineers who spend their careers building simulated environments, games, virtual reality, digital twins of physical systems, naturally find it plausible that reality itself might be a more sophisticated version of what they build every day. The simulation hypothesis flatters the technological worldview. It suggests that the universe operates on principles that software engineers understand and might eventually master. The financial implications of simulation theory belief in Silicon Valley are not trivial. Reports emerged in 2016 that 2 unnamed Silicon Valley billionaires had hired scientists to investigate whether we are living in a simulation, with the goal of breaking out of it. The New Yorker reported that the idea of breaking out of the simulation had become a recurring topic at technology industry parties. The simulation hypothesis had evolved from a philosophical argument into a research agenda, not in philosophy departments, but in the private laboratories of the world's wealthiest technology entrepreneurs. The psychological appeal of the simulation hypothesis to technology elites is worth examining. For individuals who have achieved extraordinary wealth and influence through the creation of technological systems, the idea that reality itself is a technological system is both intellectually satisfying and personally validating. It suggests that the skills and knowledge that made them successful are not merely useful in one domain, but are keys to understanding the fundamental nature of existence.
The simulation hypothesis transforms technologists from successful business people into potential prophets, individuals who, through their work with information systems, have glimpsed the true nature of reality. The dangers of elite endorsement are significant. When a figure like Musk states that we are almost certainly in a simulation, the statement carries an authority that far exceeds its epistemic warrant. Musk is not a philosopher, a physicist, or a cognitive scientist. His expertise is in engineering and business. His endorsement of the simulation hypothesis is no more scientifically authoritative than his endorsement of any other proposition outside his area of expertise. But the cultural authority of technological success translates in public perception into intellectual authority across domains. The result is that a philosophical proposition of genuine complexity is reduced to a soundbite endorsed by a celebrity, losing the nuance and qualification that make it intellectually interesting. The broader phenomenon of billionaire metaphysics, the tendency of extremely wealthy technology entrepreneurs to develop and promote theories about the fundamental nature of reality, raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between wealth, intelligence, and epistemic authority. The fact that someone has built a successful car company or rocket company does not qualify them to pronounce on the nature of consciousness, the physics of computation, or the probability that reality is simulated. But in a culture that equates financial success with general intelligence, the distinction between domain expertise and general authority is easily lost. The simulation hypothesis has benefited enormously from the endorsement of high-status figures, and that endorsement has come at the cost of the careful, qualified, genuinely complex argument that Bostrom originally presented.
The cultural impact of billionaire endorsement has been to transform the simulation hypothesis from a philosophical argument into a popular belief, complete with its own community, its own media ecosystem, and its own emotional dynamics. Simulation theory YouTube channels accumulate millions of subscribers. Simulation theory subreddits generate continuous discussion. Simulation theory has become a standard topic at technology conferences, in podcast interviews, and in the broader discourse of technology culture. The argument has been democratized, which would be admirable if the democratization had preserved the argument's complexity. Instead, the complex trilemma has been reduced to a simple claim. We are in a simulation, and the evidence is the trajectory of video game graphics. The cultural impact of simulation theory cannot be understood without understanding The Matrix. Released in 1999, 4 years before Bostrom's paper, the Wachowskis' film depicted a world in which humanity is unknowingly trapped in a computer simulation, their bodies harvested for energy while their minds experience a simulated reality indistinguishable from the real world. The film's protagonist, Neo, is offered a choice between a red pill that will reveal the true nature of reality and a blue pill that will return him to comfortable ignorance. Neo takes the red pill. The world he discovers is terrifying, liberating, and real, and the film became one of the most culturally influential science fiction works in cinema history. The Matrix did not invent the concept of simulated reality. It drew on Baudrillard's simulacra and simulation, on Plato's cave, on Philip K. Dick's reality-questioning fiction, and on the cyberpunk tradition established by William Gibson. But it gave the concept a visual vocabulary, a narrative structure, and an emotional resonance that no philosophical paper could match. The image of reality dissolving into cascading green code became the definitive visual metaphor for the simulation hypothesis. The red pill and blue pill became the most recognizable symbols of the choice between comfortable illusion and terrifying truth.
The red pill metaphor has had a cultural afterlife far beyond its original context. In the 2010s and 2020s, taking the red pill became shorthand in multiple subcultures for adopting a contrarian or counter-establishment worldview.
Men's rights activists used it to describe rejecting feminist perspectives. Political conservatives used it to describe rejecting liberal orthodoxies. Conspiracy theorists used it to describe awakening to hidden truths. The metaphor's versatility, it can be applied to any situation in which a person believes they have seen through a dominant narrative to a hidden reality, made it one of the most widely adopted cultural symbols of the 21st century, though its various adoptions are often mutually contradictory. The Truman Show, released in 1998, presented a complementary version of the simulated reality concept. Jim Carrey's Truman Burbank lives in an entirely constructed reality, a vast television set in which every person he encounters is an actor, every event is scripted, and his entire life has been broadcast without his knowledge or consent. The film's emotional power lay in Truman's gradual realization that his reality is fabricated, a realization that mirrors the existential experience of encountering simulation theory for the first time. The moment when Truman's sailboat strikes the painted wall at the edge of his world became a metaphor for the boundaries of perceived reality. The phenomenon of simulation anxiety, genuine existential distress triggered by serious engagement with the simulation hypothesis, has been documented by psychologists and reported anecdotally in online communities. People who take the simulation hypothesis seriously report feelings of depersonalization, a sense that the self is not real, derealization, a sense that the world is not real, and existential despair, a sense that nothing matters if reality is simulated. These symptoms overlap with clinical depersonalization-derealization disorder, and some therapists have reported treating patients whose symptoms were triggered or exacerbated by engagement with simulation theory content.
The entertainment industry's ongoing engagement with simulation themes has continued to grow. Rick and Morty, the animated television series, regularly explores simulation within simulation scenarios with darkly comic results. The video game industry has produced numerous titles exploring simulated reality concepts, from The Sims to Soma to Outer Wilds. Black Mirror has dedicated multiple episodes to the ethics and horror of simulated consciousness. Each new cultural product introduces the simulation concept to a new audience, normalizing the idea that reality might not be what it seems. The bidirectional relationship between entertainment and belief creates a feedback loop that has no obvious stopping point. Films and television shows about simulated reality are inspired by philosophical arguments. Philosophical arguments become more widely known because of films and television shows. People who encounter the arguments through entertainment sometimes adopt them as genuine beliefs. Those beliefs generate demand for more entertainment on the same themes. The simulation hypothesis is, in this sense, a cultural perpetual motion machine, an idea that generates its own audience, which generates its own media, which generates more audience. The Matrix's cultural legacy extends beyond entertainment into politics, philosophy, and identity. The film's aesthetic, leather coats, sunglasses, slow-motion action, cascading code, has become the visual language of a certain kind of anti-establishment thinking. Its dialogue, "There is no spoon, free your mind," has entered common usage, and its central metaphor, that the world you think you know is a prison designed to keep you docile, has been adopted by movements across the political spectrum as a framework for understanding their relationship to power. The Matrix did not create the simulation hypothesis, but it created the cultural conditions in which the simulation hypothesis could thrive.
The question of whether entertainment exposure to simulation concepts causes genuine philosophical belief or merely provides a vocabulary for expressing pre-existing doubts about reality is probably unanswerable. What is clear is that the relationship between the two is intimate and mutually reinforcing. The simulation hypothesis would be far less culturally significant without the matrix, and the matrix would be far less culturally resonant without the genuine philosophical arguments that give its premise intellectual weight. Together, they have created a cultural phenomenon that is simultaneously entertainment, philosophy, conspiracy theory, and spiritual practice, a phenomenon with no clear boundaries and no obvious endpoint. The simulation hypothesis as cultural phenomenon raises a final question about the nature of belief itself. When a person says they believe we are living in a simulation, what exactly do they mean? Do they mean it in the way a physicist means a hypothesis is supported by evidence? In the way a philosopher means a proposition is logically valid? In the way a conspiracy theorist means a hidden truth has been uncovered? Or in the way a moviegoer means a story has become so compelling that it has colonized their imagination? The simulation hypothesis occupies all of these registers simultaneously, and its cultural power derives precisely from this ambiguity. It is a theory that can be held seriously or lightly, literally or metaphorically, as science or as poetry. This flexibility is both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability to misuse. The simulation hypothesis is not without serious objections, objections raised not by conspiracy theory debunkers, but by professional philosophers and physicists who have engaged with Bostrom's argument on its own terms. These objections do not conclusively refute the simulation hypothesis, but they demonstrate that the argument is far less settled than popular presentations suggest. The simulation hypothesis is a genuine philosophical puzzle, not a solved problem, and the strongest arguments against it are as intellectually rigorous as the arguments for it.
The consciousness objection is the most fundamental challenge. The simulation argument's probability calculation assumes that simulated beings are conscious, that a sufficiently detailed computational model of a brain would generate genuine subjective experience. If simulated beings are not conscious, if there is something about biological brains that cannot be replicated computationally, then the probability calculation fails entirely. There would be many simulated beings, but zero simulated conscious beings, and the argument that we are probably simulated would collapse. The consciousness objection rests on the hard problem of consciousness, the deepest unsolved problem in philosophy of mind, and cannot be resolved until the nature of consciousness itself is understood. The computational limits objection argues that simulating an entire universe at the quantum level may require more computational resources than any civilization could assemble. A universe containing approximately 10 to the 80th atoms, each with quantum properties that must be computed, would require a computer of inconceivable scale and power. Even if Moore's law continued indefinitely, and there are strong physical reasons to believe it cannot, the computational requirements for a full-fidelity universe simulation might exceed the total available energy of any physical universe. This objection does not refute the simulation hypothesis entirely. The simulation might take shortcuts, simulating only what is being observed, but it challenges the assumption that ancestor simulations would be easy or common. The infinite regress objection observes that if we are in a simulation, our simulators might also be in a simulation, and their simulators might also be simulated, creating an infinite chain of nested simulations. Each level of simulation requires computational resources from the level above, and the resources available at each level are necessarily less than at the level above. This creates a problem. Either the chain terminates at some base reality, in which case there is at least one reality that is not simulated, or the chain is infinite, which raises its own paradoxes about the nature of computation. The infinite regress does not refute the simulation hypothesis entirely, but complicates the probability calculations on which it rests.
Some physicists have argued that quantum mechanical phenomena may be fundamentally incomputable, that the behavior of quantum systems cannot be fully simulated by any classical or quantum computer. If this is the case, then no civilization, however advanced, could create a fully accurate simulation of a quantum universe. The precise computational requirements of quantum mechanics remain debated, and the development of quantum computers has complicated the argument. But the possibility that quantum mechanics is incomputable represents a potential fundamental obstacle to the simulation hypothesis. Philosopher Barry Dainton has argued that the simulation hypothesis proves too much, that if taken seriously, it undermines all empirical reasoning and makes science itself impossible. If we cannot trust that our observations correspond to an external reality, then the observations on which the simulation argument is based, the observations of computational technology, of technological progress, of the laws of physics, are themselves unreliable. The argument consumes its own evidential foundation. This is a version of the self-refuting argument that applies to all radical skeptical hypotheses, from Descartes' demon to the brain in a vat. The ethical objection, raised by several philosophers, concerns the implications of the simulation hypothesis for moral reasoning. If we take the hypothesis seriously and believe there is a significant probability that we are simulated, should this change how we behave? Some have argued that it should not, that simulated suffering is still suffering, that simulated persons still have moral standing, and that the ethics of compassion and justice apply regardless of the substrate on which consciousness runs. Others have worried that taking the simulation hypothesis seriously could lead to nihilism, the conclusion that nothing matters if everything is computed, or to reckless behavior motivated by the belief that reality is not real.
The cumulative weight of these objections does not refute the simulation hypothesis. It does, however, establish that the hypothesis is far more uncertain than popular presentations suggest. Bostrom's trilemma remains logically valid. At least one of the three propositions must be true, but the question of which proposition is true remains genuinely open. The simulation hypothesis is possible. It may even be probable, but it is not established, and the confidence with which it is asserted in popular culture exceeds the confidence warranted by the philosophical arguments. The honest conclusion is that the simulation hypothesis is undecidable, not in the technical sense used in mathematics, but in the practical sense that we may never have sufficient evidence to determine whether it is true or false. A sufficiently advanced simulation would be, by definition, indistinguishable from reality. The search for simulation artifacts in physics is worth pursuing, but may yield no definitive results. The philosophical arguments are valid but inconclusive. The simulation hypothesis may be the kind of question that human beings are capable of asking, but fundamentally incapable of answering, a question that reveals the limits of knowledge itself. If we are living in a simulation, can we prove it? The question has drawn physicists into what might seem like a fool's errand, the attempt to find evidence within the simulation that the simulation exists. It is analogous to a character in a video game trying to detect the hardware on which the game runs.
The task may be impossible in principle. A well-designed simulation would leave no detectable artifacts. But physicists have proposed several approaches, each based on the premise that any simulation running on finite computational resources must, at some level, leave traces of its computational nature in the physics it generates.
The most widely discussed proposal came from Silas Bean, Zora Davuti, and Martin Savage at the University of Washington, who published a paper in 2012 examining the constraints that lattice computation would impose on simulated physics. The idea was elegant. Current simulations of quantum chromodynamics, the physics of quarks and gluons inside atomic nuclei, use a discrete lattice structure that introduces specific artifacts into the simulated physics. If the universe is simulated on a similar lattice, those artifacts should be detectable as anisotropies in the distribution of ultra-high-energy cosmic rays. The prediction was specific enough to be testable, though the data required was beyond what observatories had collected at the time. Other researchers have proposed looking for signs of computational shortcuts, evidence that the simulation does not compute the full detail of the universe at all times, but instead generates detail only as needed. This would be analogous to the rendering strategies used in video games, where only the visible scene is rendered in full detail, while off-screen areas are stored as simplified approximations. In physical terms, this might manifest as subtle differences in the behavior of physical systems, depending on whether they are being observed or measured, a phenomenon that, intriguingly, already exists in quantum mechanics, though conventional interpretations explain it without reference to simulation. The Planck scale, the smallest meaningful unit of length in physics, approximately 10 to the minus 35 meters, has been proposed as the possible pixel resolution of the simulation. If spacetime is discrete at the Planck scale, this discreteness might produce observable effects at much larger scales, analogous to how the pixelation of a digital image becomes visible when zoomed in sufficiently. Several experiments and observations have been proposed to detect Planck scale granularity, though none have yet produced definitive results. The difficulty is that the Planck scale is so unimaginably small. A Planck length is to a proton what a proton is to the entire Milky Way, that direct observation is far beyond current technology.
The fundamental problem with all simulation tests is what might be called the sufficiency objection. A sufficiently advanced simulator could produce a simulation that is by definition indistinguishable from reality. Any artifact we might detect could be patched. Any test we might devise could be anticipated. Any anomaly we might discover could be explained within the simulation's own physics. If the simulators are intelligent enough to create a universe that contains beings capable of questioning whether they are simulated, they are presumably intelligent enough to create a universe that does not reveal its simulated nature to those beings. The theological dimension of the simulation hypothesis has attracted significant philosophical attention. If the simulation hypothesis is true, then the entity or entities running the simulation occupy a position functionally identical to the traditional concept of God. They created the universe, they established its laws, they have the power to intervene in or terminate it, and they exist outside the reality they created. The simulation hypothesis does not prove the existence of God in any traditional theological sense, but it provides a technologically grounded framework for the concept of a creator, a framework that some philosophers have found intriguing and others have found deeply troubling. The possibility that the simulation could be shut off has generated its own subset of existential anxiety. If we are living in a simulation, the simulation presumably has a purpose: entertainment, research, ancestor simulation, or something beyond human comprehension. If that purpose is fulfilled, or if the simulators lose interest, the simulation could be terminated, not gradually, but instantaneously, without warning.
The entire universe and everything in it would simply cease to exist. This is not unlike the traditional religious concept of the end of the world, but without the possibility of salvation or continuation in any form.
Some have proposed attempting to signal to the simulators to attract their attention in the hope of receiving information or assistance. The proposals range from the serious, creating computational patterns that would be recognized as significant by the simulators, to the tongue-in-cheek, collectively looking up at the sky and shouting, "We know." The proposals assume that the simulators are watching, that they would respond to signals from within the simulation, and that their response would be beneficial rather than hostile. These are assumptions with no evidential basis, but they reveal the deeply human tendency to seek relationship even with hypothetical entities that transcend human comprehension. The honest assessment of simulation testing is that we currently have no way to determine whether we are living in a simulation, and we may never have such a way. The tests that have been proposed are scientifically interesting and worth pursuing, but they face fundamental obstacles. The scale at which simulation artifacts would appear may be beyond current observational capability. The simulators may be capable of hiding artifacts, and the simulation hypothesis may be structured in a way that makes it inherently untestable. The simulation hypothesis may be true, it may be false, but it may also be permanently unknowable, a question that reveals the boundary of human knowledge rather than extending it. The simulation hypothesis began in a philosophy journal. It now resides simultaneously in academic departments, in Silicon Valley boardrooms, in Hollywood studios, and in the conspiracy theory underground. The journey from Oxford to InfoWars, from peer-reviewed argument to conspiracy theory content, illustrates how legitimate intellectual inquiry can be absorbed, simplified, and distorted by the conspiracy theory ecosystem. The simulation hypothesis has become a component of the broader conspiracy framework that holds reality itself to be a prison, a manufactured illusion designed to keep humanity ignorant, compliant, and controllable.
The connection to David Icke's worldview is direct and explicit. Icke has incorporated simulation theory into his conspiracy framework, arguing that the universe is a holographic illusion broadcast by reptilian entities who control the simulation. His moon matrix concept, the claim that the moon broadcasts a reality-limiting frequency, is, in structural terms, a version of the simulation hypothesis with specific alien architects identified. For Icke, the simulation hypothesis is not a philosophical puzzle, but a revelation. Reality is a prison, the simulators are reptilian overlords, and awakening to this truth is the first step toward liberation. The epistemological danger of treating the simulation hypothesis as a conspiracy theory lies in its unfalsifiability. In its philosophical formulation, the simulation hypothesis is presented as an open question, a possibility to be considered, not a certainty to be asserted. In its conspiracy theory formulation, it becomes a certainty that explains everything. Any evidence against the theory is itself part of the simulation. Any debunking is programmed disinformation, and any person who disagrees is an NPC, a non-player character, a simulated entity without genuine consciousness. This transformation from open question to closed certainty is the defining move of conspiracy epistemology, and it strips the simulation hypothesis of everything that made it intellectually valuable.
The NPC meme, which emerged in internet culture in the late 2010s, illustrates the social toxicity of simulation theory when applied to real people. The concept of the NPC, originally a video game term for computer-controlled characters who follow scripted behaviors, was adopted by online communities to describe people perceived as unthinking, conformist, or ideologically programmed. Calling someone an NPC implies that they are not a real conscious being, but a simulation-generated entity following a script, a dehumanization that draws directly on simulation theory concepts. The NPC meme has been used to dismiss political opponents, to justify disengagement from democratic dialogue, and to dehumanize individuals whose views differ from one's own.
The New Age spiritual community has also incorporated simulation theory into its framework, interpreting the hypothesis through the lens of Eastern mysticism and Gnostic Christianity. In this interpretation, the simulation is not a computer program, but a spiritual prison, Maya in the Hindu tradition, the demiurge's creation in Gnostic thought. Awakening from the simulation is equated with spiritual enlightenment, the realization that the material world is an illusion, and the true reality is a higher dimensional consciousness of which we are all fragments. This spiritual interpretation is, for many people, a source of comfort and meaning, but it also demonstrates how the simulation hypothesis functions as a blank screen onto which any pre-existing worldview can be projected. The conspiracy theory YouTube ecosystem has transformed simulation theory into a content genre with its own conventions, dramatic narration, visual effects showing reality dissolving into code, ominous music, and titles like "The Proof We Are in a Simulation They Do Not Want You to See." These videos mix legitimate philosophical arguments with unfounded claims, cherry-picked scientific evidence with pure speculation, and genuine wonder with manufactured paranoia. For viewers who encounter simulation theory through this ecosystem, which is how most non-academics encounter it, the theory is not an intellectual puzzle, but a revealed truth, presented with the production values and emotional manipulation of a documentary, but without the epistemic standards. The simulation hypothesis serves as a gateway into the broader conspiracy ecosystem because it legitimizes a fundamental conspiratorial premise that reality is not what it seems and that powerful forces are responsible for maintaining the illusion. Once a person accepts this premise, even in the qualified philosophical form in which Bostrom presented it, the psychological barriers to accepting other conspiracy claims are lowered. If reality itself might be a deception, then any specific claim about deception within that reality becomes more plausible. The simulation hypothesis does not cause conspiracy thinking, but it can facilitate it by normalizing the premise that appearances are fundamentally unreliable.
The academic community bears some responsibility for the simulation hypothesis's absorption into conspiracy culture. Philosophers who engage with the argument as a serious intellectual proposition rarely engage with equal seriousness with its cultural reception. The argument is published, debated in journals, and discussed at conferences, but the mechanisms by which it enters and is distorted by public discourse receive far less attention. The simulation hypothesis has demonstrated that philosophical arguments do not remain safely within the academy. They escape, and when they do, they are shaped by cultural forces that philosophers do not control and often do not acknowledge. The challenge for thinkers who take the simulation hypothesis seriously, while being aware of its cultural dangers, is to maintain intellectual honesty without enabling conspiracy thinking. This requires clearly distinguishing between the philosophical argument, a carefully qualified trilemma, and the conspiracy assertion, we are definitely in a simulation controlled by malevolent entities. It requires acknowledging the argument's genuine intellectual value while being honest about its limitations and uncertainties. And it requires recognizing that the same argument can function as a contribution to human knowledge in one context and as a tool of human manipulation in another, and that the difference lies not in the argument itself, but in the epistemic standards with which it is engaged. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that the simulation hypothesis is correct. Suppose that the most thorough investigation possible has conclusively demonstrated that the universe we inhabit is a computational process running on hardware operated by entities we cannot perceive, in a reality we cannot access. Suppose it is proven beyond doubt. What changes? The question is not merely hypothetical. It is the question that determines whether the simulation hypothesis matters, or whether it is, as some philosophers have argued, a fascinating but ultimately irrelevant curiosity.
The first and most important observation is that the experiential reality of consciousness would not change. If you are a simulated being, your experiences are real to you. Your pain hurts, your joy brings pleasure, your love feels genuine, your grief is as devastating as it would be in any reality. The simulation hypothesis does not claim that experience is illusory. It claims that the substrate generating the experience is different from what we assume. The sunset is still beautiful. The music is still moving. The child's laughter is still delightful. The substance of human experience would be exactly the same the day after proof of simulation as it was the day before. The ethical implications are, by the same reasoning, unchanged. If simulated suffering is real suffering, if the computational process that generates the experience of pain is as morally significant as the biological process, then our obligations to each other remain exactly what they were. The prohibition against causing unnecessary suffering applies regardless of whether the sufferer is a biological organism or a simulated consciousness. The obligation to help those in need persists. The value of justice, compassion, and human dignity is not diminished by the discovery that these qualities emerge from a computational process rather than a biological one. Ethics, in this view, is substrate independent, just like consciousness. Some philosophers have argued that proof of simulation would be psychologically devastating, that knowledge that reality is not real would trigger an epidemic of nihilism, depression, and social collapse. The historical evidence suggests otherwise. Religions have taught for millennia that the material world is illusory. Maya in Hinduism, samsara in Buddhism, the fallen world in Gnostic Christianity, without triggering civilizational collapse among their billions of adherents. The idea that reality is not ultimate reality is not new. What is new is the technological language in which the idea is now expressed. Human beings have an extraordinary capacity to adapt their meaning-making systems to new information about the nature of reality, and there is no reason to assume that proof of simulation would exceed that adaptive capacity. The political and social implications might, however, be significant. If we knew that our universe was created and maintained by external entities, the question of those entities' intentions would become the most important question in existence. Are we an experiment, an entertainment, an ancestor simulation, a school, a prison, a work of art? Each answer would carry different implications for how we should organize our societies and live our lives. The simulation hypothesis, if proven, would not tell us what the simulation is for, and that uncertainty might be more psychologically challenging than the proof of simulation itself. The relationship to the simulators would raise questions without precedent in human experience. We would know that entities more powerful than any god described in human religion exist outside our reality and have total control over it. We would not know their intentions, their moral character, or whether they are aware of us as conscious beings. We would not know whether they would respond to attempts at communication, whether they observe us individually or only as a system, or whether they could intervene in our reality if they chose to. The epistemological situation would be unprecedented. We would know that a higher reality exists while knowing almost nothing about it. The scientific community would face a fundamental reorientation. If the laws of physics are programmed rather than natural, then physics becomes a form of reverse engineering, an attempt to understand the simulator's code rather than the fundamental nature of reality. The distinction between a natural law and a computational rule would collapse. The question of why the laws of physics have the form they do would have a simple answer, because the programmer chose those forms. This would resolve some of the deepest mysteries in physics, the fine-tuning of constants, the arrow of time, the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, but at the cost of replacing physical explanation with speculation about computational design choices.
For some people, the simulation hypothesis, if proven, would function as a kind of secular spirituality. The knowledge that reality was created by intelligent beings, that there is a reality beyond our own, and that our existence serves some purpose, even if we do not know what it is, maps structurally onto the basic claims of most religions. The simulation hypothesis could become the foundation for a new form of meaning-making, one that retains the structure of religious belief, creation, purpose, transcendence, while replacing its traditional content, God, revelation, afterlife, with technological concepts, programmer, code, higher reality. Whether this would be a gain or a loss for human civilization is a question that each person must answer for themselves. The final and most profound implication of the simulation hypothesis is about the nature of questions themselves. The question, "Are we living in a simulation?" may be more valuable for its asking than for any possible answer. The question forces us to confront the limits of knowledge, the relationship between consciousness and reality, the nature of experience, and the meaning of existence, questions that have been at the center of human inquiry since consciousness first turned its attention on itself. Whether we are simulated or not, these questions matter. Whether the sunset is computed or natural, it is still beautiful. Whether love is biological or simulated, it is still real.
The simulation hypothesis is, at its core, the latest chapter in humanity's longest conversation, the conversation about what is real, what matters, and how we should live in a universe whose ultimate nature may be forever beyond our comprehension. The conversation began in a Chinese garden, where a philosopher dreamed he was a butterfly. It continued in a Greek cave, where prisoners watched shadows on a wall. It passed through a French study, where a philosopher doubted everything, through a British thought experiment about brains in vats, through an Oxford paper that rewrote the terms of the debate, and through a Hollywood film that made the debate visceral. The conversation is not finished. It may never be finished. But the fact that we can have it, that we are the kind of beings who can question our own reality and wonder about the nature of existence, is itself the most remarkable fact about the universe, simulated or otherwise.